It is the middle of the 5th century AD, and while the armies of Attila, his generals and his sons reign suffering death and destruction on both the eastern and western provinces of the Roman Empire, far away on the Central Asian plain, Rome's long-standing and worthy adversary, the Sasanian Empire, is facing a similar onslaught. From the Derbent Pass in the west to Bactria in the east, Hunnic peoples, terrifying riders whose violence and cruelty is almost without precedent, hammer at the outposts of Sasanian rule, and soon begin to encroach further and further into the heartland of the King of Kings. I'm fortunate to have found a line of work that I love. But far too many people work jobs that they hate. Still, you can always turn things around. If you're looking for a fulfilling career that makes a difference in the world, I strongly recommend checking out 80,000 Hours, the sponsor of this video. What they offer is completely free. 80,000 Hours is a non-profit that provides free advice to help people find a fulfilling career and tackle the world's important and pressing problems. 80,000 hours is the typical amount of time a person spends working during their lifetime. 40 hours per week, 50 weeks per year, for 40 years. That is a lot of time. This means that your career is a major driver of your happiness, but also probably your biggest opportunity to impact the world positively. The non-profit has conducted over 10 years of research alongside academics at Oxford University into how to find a fulfilling career that does a lot of good. 3 things I like about all this. It's based on verifiable research, it aims to bring a positive impact globally, and it's totally free. Go to 80,000hours.org/historymarsh and get an in-depth copy of their career guide. Next, make a plan based on everything you've learned and put it into action. You've got nothing to lose by signing up. It's free, so you can help support my channel by signing up at 80,000hours.org for research, advice, and resources that could be life-changing. For rulers of empires, every step is a lesson learned. Due to the existential threats that both empires now face, the Romans and the Sasanians for the first time display little interest in fighting long, costly wars with one another in the late 400s. For the Sasanians, their belligerence and formidable military power is directed almost entirely against northern and eastern neighbours, especially the Kidarites, a Hunnic people who have taken control of Bactria, the Kabul Valley, Gandhara and Kashmir in the century before, and have pushed into Persia proper. After concluding a final war with the Eastern Romans in the 420s, Bahram V Gur defended the empire against a Kidarite invasion that reached as far as Ray, defeating their army and recapturing Merv. The enemy king fell in battle, crushed by the heavily armoured cataphracts of the Sasanian host. Just as the destruction of Attila had not ended the barbarian menace to Rome, the Kidarites were similarly uninterrupted by this reversal. And Bahram's successor, Yazdegerd II, then spent most of his reign warring against the Kidarites, campaigning with mixed success up to the year of his death. A dynastic struggle between his sons led to the younger of the brothers, Peroz, employing barbarian auxiliaries from the Kidarite regions, making use of the Hephtalites, who were also known as the White Huns, to become the dominant leader in the Sasanian realm. Peroz had taken the throne with the help of a Hephthalite king named Kushnawar by 460, and 6 years later, likely once more with Kushnawar's help, he defeated the main Kidarite power and reclaimed Bactria for the empire. Kushnawar and the Hephtalites, meanwhile, had been granted the city of Talakan as well as other territories for their assistance in aiding the new King of Kings. The good relations, however, were not to last. The lands of Bactria were tax-rich, and Peroz was not likely to allow anyone, even those whose assistance had been vital to his ascent, to hold what appeared to be an advantage, let alone autonomy over what he considered his rightful territory. As a result, Peroz marched an army against his former ally in 474. Peroz was convinced, with the weight of centuries of precedent, that his imperial force would beat any agglomeration of tribes. He even recruited a former servant of Kushnawar who had been mutilated as a punishment by the Hephthalite king to act as his guide and show him the best approach to catch the upstart unawares. Unfortunately for Peroz, the guide was in fact a double agent, and he led the Sasanians through the steep defiles and stony valleys of Bactria straight into an ambush. The Hephtalites fell on the slow-moving cataphracts, where their packed numbers and heavy armor nullified the Sasanian advantage, and the King of Kings himself was taken prisoner after being forced to ask for a truce and negotiations, while his army was vaporized around him. In a triple humiliation, Peroz was forced to call on his satraps and ministers to raise money for his ransom, but the Roman Emperor Zeno, who had already been sending funds to the Sasanians to assist with the barbarian threat, was also required to send a donation to his fellow monarch and secure his release. Peroz was forced to vow not to attack the Hephtalites in the future, and he also ceded all of Bactria to Kushnawar, allowing the Hephthalite army to take possession of the important mint at bulk. Combined with a hefty separate tribute to Kushnawar, Peroz was now to all intents and purposes the vassal of the Hephthalite overlord. Flushed with victory, the Hephtalites expanded to a far greater degree. They pursued the Kidarites further, extending into Udayana, Kashmir and Gandhara, and then moved northwest into Kharazmia. They also advanced into the Tarim Basin, where the Oasis kingdoms were vassals of the massive Rouran Khaganate. In spite of this formidable challenge, the Hephtalites conquered the kingdoms of Kashgar, Kargalik, Khotan, Aksu, Kutsha, Karashar and Turfan, defeating any forces that the Rourans sent their way. Annexation of the kingdom of Sogdiana rounded out this series of triumphs. Sogdiana became the wealthiest region within the realm, as the Hephtalites reinvented the proceeds from taxes, trade contacts and tribute into Sogdian cities, including Bukhara, Samarkand and Panjakent. Thus, the Hephtalites became the great intermediaries of Eurasia. It was necessary for merchants from Rome, Persia, India and China to travel through their lands in pursuit of the lucrative trade, and the Hephthalite ruling class became increasingly wealthy as a result. Their capital, Varvaliz, was probably located near the present-day city of Kunduz. Along with besting the Sasanian superpower, their wealth far exceeded that of their nomadic Hunnic kinsmen. The Roman historian Procopius noted that the Hephtalites were far more settled than the Huns of Europe, who could not hope to mimic these income streams in the far north of Europe and Sarmatia. Back at Ctesiphon, the Sasanian capital, the level of outflow in coins paid to Kushnawar for tribute was beginning to deplete the exchequer, and a great increase in the flow of Sasanian currency was noted in China. This state of affairs was unconscionable to Peroz, who had to contend in the late 470s and early 480s with widespread drought. Disaffection and indeed desperation had compelled some of Peroz's subjects to begin raiding into East Roman lands beyond the Euphrates, and war with their now stronger western neighbor became a possibility before negotiations managed to cool the situation. Attempting to regain his honor, channel discontent, and end the outward flow of currency that was draining his treasury, Peroz launched a second invasion of Hephthalite territory. Kushnawar saw that once more the King of Kings would have the advantage in a straight set-piece battle, so he withdrew before the Sasanian advance, feigning retreat. He did not flee, however. Keeping his rear guard visible to the advancing Sasanians, the Hephthalite king instead baited the vengeful host. Motivated by these fresh insults, as well as the previous disaster of Peroz's earlier defeat, the Sasanian royal army pursued Kushnawar into a valley bordered by mountains. Unbeknownst to them, the far end of the valley was a dead end, screened by a tree line, making the lack of a second exit invisible to anyone unfamiliar with the terrain. Kushnawar and his men knew these lands better than Peroz, and before marching too deeply into the valley, he turned his army aside to make camp in secret. He concealed his forces in the rough terrain and simultaneously detached a small decoy force to continue the retreat. Peroz's scouts caught sight of the decoy force soon after, and presuming that they were still in contact with Kushnawar's main host, continued the pursuit. Kushnawar allowed them to march past his position, followed by the Sasanian royal army as it advanced deeper into the wooded valley. However, the trees concealed the fact that the mountains blocked any means to advance further. As the paths narrowed, the Sasanian scouts found it increasingly difficult to find a way forward. Soon, Kushnawar's army appeared from behind and approached the Sasanian position. Too late, and with a stultifying sense of anguish and gut-wrenching disappointment, Peroz and his generals realized that they could neither advance nor retreat. The Sasanian army, a mass force designed to make use of wide spaces to deploy and orchestrate its battles, was now kettled like a fish in a barrel and at risk of being butchered in the confined, inescapable space. However, a trapped enemy is a desperate enemy, and yet again showing a profound mind for strategy as well as tactics, Kushnawar did not wish to suffer heavy casualties attacking the invaders. It was much better to again exhibit his power over the King of Kings, and perhaps even let Peroz's own people take care of his dispatchment. He offered the King of Kings and his men the opportunity to surrender, on the condition that he prostrate himself before the Hephthalite overlord. Peroz was also to promise never again to take up arms against the Hephthalite Empire. Looking at the lethal predicament surrounding him and his army, Peroz accepted, but on the advice of the Persian Magi, he met with Kushnawar at dawn, so that when he prostrated himself, it could be argued that he was actually honoring the rising sun, and not the former chieftain who had bested him. Peroz thus avoided the dishonor of giving obeisance. For the second time in less than 10 years, however, Kushnawar had made him prisoner. Peroz was freed on the condition that he send 30 mules laden with silver coins, swear an oath over a sacred bag of salt, and sign a treaty solemnly declaring his vow not to attack or betray Kushnawar once more. After his extensively diminished treasury could send only 20 such animals, Peroz allowed Kushnawar to hold his son Kavad as a hostage until the remainder was paid. Kushnawar was depicted on coins in the aftermath of his second great victory, wearing a winged triple crescent crown, a crown that Peroz also wore on coins. The symbolism and message were unmistakable. Kushnawar was presenting himself as the rightful ruler of Iran. Still, undeterred by past failures and by unrest in Armenia, Peroz once more set off to subdue the new Hephthalite Empire, once Kavad had been released 2 years later in 484. In his action, he was flagrantly breaking the oaths that he had made not to fracture the peace with Kushnawar, and this, as well as the previous disasters in eastern campaigns, caused widespread disquiet amongst his councillors and the rank and file. Amongst the former, General Bahram and Peroz's advisor Muzdbawa both repeatedly protested, while the latter feared divine punishment. Peroz spared no expense for this third campaign. Along with the usual gargantuan Sasanian host, he was accompanied by all of his sons, except Kavad, who was still a child. Meanwhile, Kushnawar, like his near-contemporary Attila, was not leading a homogeneous, blindly subservient people. His rule rested on his strength and ability to keep commanders and allied chieftains in line and flush with booty. Kushnawar had displayed unheralded strength in bringing Peroz to heel not once but twice, but there were those among his confederation who said that he had erred in sparing the King of Kings a second time. Kushnawar could not afford to allow Peroz to live after a third conflict, for that would make him appear weak and invite others to challenge his rule. In any case, it was highly unlikely that Peroz could afford a third ransom, given that he had already been forced to seek help from the Romans and offer his son as a hostage after the earlier battles. The Sasanian army mustered at Gurgan before marching east towards the Hephthalite lands. Kushnawar was likely aware of the massive force that was mustering to march against him, and he was well prepared for its arrival. Even so, he sent warnings to Peroz not to break his word and attack him again. When the King of Kings ignored these admonitions and continued the invasion, Kushnawar put the intimidating Hephthalite military apparatus to work, once again harnessing the equally ferocious mind for tactics that had served him so well in his previous battles. Choosing a point between the Gargistan Mountains and the Maghreb River, on the cusp of the Karakum Desert, Kushnawar deployed his forces and then made sure that Peroz knew his position. His engineers and labouring teams set busily to work in the open plain before the main army. Like a leopard in the tall grass, the Hephthalite emperor stalked his prey. The composition of the Hephthalite army was likely similar to that of Hunnic armies in Europe, with a preponderance of cavalry adept in the use of the bow. In addition to their lighter mounted archers, the more sedentary Hephtalites had an elite heavy cavalry contingent, probably anchored around Kushnawar. The bow being their main weapon, their ranks also carried swords, clubs, maces, and spears. Perhaps crucially, their ornately decorated swords, which made use of a 2-point suspension system, and their lamella helmets, featuring a dome shape and scaled plate design, were both later put into use by the Sasanian army, indicating a Hephthalite superiority in weapons and kit. The sword and scabbard system meant that the sword could be drawn faster while on horseback, giving the Hephtalites a speed advantage in the midst of battle. Like other Hunnic armies, the Hephtalites probably used their subject peoples as infantry and cavalry, including perhaps Sogdian cavalry and Bactrian infantry, but this was assembled around a core of Hunnic cavalry, including Hephtalites and former Kidarites. The Arabic historian al-Masudi recorded that the armies met in the land of Merv, in the north of what is modern Afghanistan. For the Persians, The seemingly unnatural confluence of dun-colored mountains, green riverlands, and dry desert was an alien surface, wild and devoid of order. For every patch of artemisia grass or lonely tamarisk tree, acres of tumbleweed stalks blew against crumbling, mud-brown brick walls. The whole area a contrasting patchwork of color and stark landmarks. Drawing in sight of his nemesis, Peroz encamped some distance from the Hephtalites, with a large army composed of royal subjects and allies. To all appearances, Kushnawar and his men were waiting across an open, flat plain, itching to vent their rage on the invader. Sasanian royal armies were predominantly composed of cataphracts, including feudal Sasanian knights, and prestige units such as the Immortals and the Royal Guard, the Pushtai Ban. These units were armed with spears, swords, and maces. Like the Hephtalites, the Sasanians also fielded horse archers, and they likely employed Hunnic horsemen as mercenaries drawn from the Pontic Caspian steppe, as well as the cavalry of their vassals in Arabia. Such units could better contend with the speed of the enemy light cavalry. The Sasanians were likely equipped for siege warfare, bringing peasant light infantry, known as Payne, who were used to build and operate siege works, as well as elephants, which the Sasanians most often used as beasts of burden and as mobile archery platforms against enemy walls. Peroz also brought foot archers and elite close combat infantry, such as Dalamite mercenaries. Once their forces were deployed and both had seen the strength of the opposite host, Kushnawar again berated Peroz for his perfidy, reminding the King of Kings of his mercy. The Hephthalite's warning was stark. "If you do not heed my words, know that I will destroy you and the entire useless multitude in which you are placing your hopes." Kushnawar then hung the bag of salt over which Peroz had sworn his oath from the Hephthalite royal banners, reminding the Sasanian rank and file of the treachery of their leader. Next, he brought out the treaty made between him and Peroz and attached the paper to the tip of a lance, calling forth the gods to act according to what is in this document. The public show of pious outrage served to inspire the Hephtalites and demoralize the Sasanians and their subject allies. Attempting to save face, Peroz drew up his companies to bait Kushnawar into an attack, leaving his defensible position and fighting in the open. The Hephthalite rank and file were keen to meet the challenge, chafing at standing in position, but Kushnawar kept them in check, maintaining stern discipline. Eventually, after a protracted wait, he began to deploy the army forward, with a large unit of the cavalry in the vanguard riding out in front of the main host. These horse archers rode back and forth, firing at the Sasanian lines and withdrawing, no doubt playing a game of cat and mouse with Peroz's own mounted bowmen. This situation still favored Kushnawar, for Peroz's cataphracts would need to close with the Hephthalite line to use their strengths, and the attrition on the Sasanian companies was causing consternation that would eventually lead to a breakdown in authority. Peroz again asserted himself, making a show of riding with his sons to the front line, each one taking command of a cataphract contingent and rallying the army. Undeterred and seemingly unimpressed, the Hephthalite archers rode back and swept around in front of the King of Kings, an open insult that could not go unanswered. With a cascade of noise from the Roptran drums, a sound that was a cross between a rattlesnake and an electric storm, Peroz, his generals, and nearly his entire bloodline charged at the despicable horse archers and the main Hephthalite army. The Sasanian flanks followed their leader, hurtling forward with screams and ululations toward the Hunnic line. This was a headlong dash to drive the enemy into the river or crush them against the mountain rocks. A few of the Hephthalite horse archers held the line, fighting a rear-guard action while the majority clustered in a mass and then raced back for the safety of their main line. Kushnawur's army, meanwhile, stood stock still, seemingly petrified by the fury and dreadful sight of the huge Sasanian army. Finally, when it appeared that no help was forthcoming, the last of the horse archers turned about and rode for the safety of the center, trailing behind the others in a hurried cluster at the center of the field. Bolstered at this reversal, Peroz cried out to his army to ride and run all the harder, to gouge holes in the Hephthalite line and pulverize their entire host. Those in the rear ranks barreled behind their monarch, shouting their approval, waiting for the inevitable blast wave when the cataphract's armor and lances made contact. Peroz shouted a final war cry, and then, seemingly without any cause, he was not there anymore. The entire Sasanian front line vanished from sight like some unholy conjurer's trick. Amidst the dust and chaos, the second and third lines of cataphracts and infantry could not see what had happened to them, but the pressure and momentum of those in rear kept them moving, and all too quickly the fate of the King of Kings became apparent. Kushnawur and his army had used their time on the plain before Peroz's arrival to dig a huge trench, stretching across the entire range of the field, leaving just a narrow causeway at the center, wide enough for their own horses to cross. Then they had concealed the trap with light wooden branches and overlaid it with earth. Knowing exactly where the safe point was, his mounted archers had lured Peroz forward and then showed tantamount skill in forming a column and passing back over the trench before Peroz could catch up behind them. Now Peroz, his sons, the Immortals and his royal guard lay at the bottom of the pit. They were slowly crushed by the weight of their second and third lines of cataphract warriors, crashing on top of them. Soon hundreds of men and animals lay mangled in the ditch, the horses still alive and kicking nightmarishly to try and escape, tearing themselves and the stunned, bleeding men around them to pieces. Like lemmings on a cliff, the midlines of the army were pushed back into the black hole. Knights, nobility and royalty, the flower of the Sasanian Empire, crushed in a pit. The Hephtalites counterattacked, knowing the safe points around the trench to avoid falling and meeting the same fate as their enemy. Having lost all cohesion, the front ranks of the Sasanians were butchered in a heap. Innumerable knights and commanders were dead, and those in the rear soon realized the magnitude of the disaster and surrendered en masse. By nightfall, Kushnawur took control of the Sasanian camp, including the treasury, administrative documents, the chief Mobed or high priest Ardashir, and female members of the Sasanian dynasty, including Peroz's daughter, Peroz-Dukt. When the dust had settled, it was discovered that Peroz had been slain, along with 4 of his sons and 4 of his brothers, including his brother Hormizd, the commander of his vanguard. To quote al-Tabiri, the Persian army suffered a defeat the likes of which they had never before experienced. According to sources, the entire Sasanian army perished. In the aftermath of the calamity at Merv, Kushnawur invaded Khorasan and Arahosia and spent 2 years raiding the rudderless empire of the Sasanians. He and his armies conquered Herat, Nishapur, and Kandahar. He met some resistance from the satrap of Sakistan, Sukra, but his achievements were exaggerated in later Persian sources. Having secured his overlordship, Kushnawar married Peraz-Dukt, daughter of the fallen Peraz, which further strengthened his legitimacy. The new Sasanian king, Peraz's brother Balash, secured a treaty with Kushnawar and resumed paying tribute, and through Sukra's mediation, the Hephtalites returned the high priest Ardashir and certain other captives. With Sasanian finances in dire straits, however, Balash was overthrown in 488, and the Iranian nobility elevated Peraz's son, Kavad. Kavad, who had spent years as Kushnawar's hostage, appears to have advocated a policy of peaceful coexistence with the Hephtalites. Tellingly, when he was in turn overthrown less than a decade later, Kavad fled to the Hephthalite court and secured an alliance with Kushnawar, marrying the half-Sasanian daughter of Kushnawar and Peraz-Dukt. In 498, he then returned to Persia with a Hephthalite army and reclaimed his throne. Such was the power of the Hephtalites as major power brokers, much the same as the Germanic tribes in the Western Roman Empire. Kavad temporarily accepted the status quo, instead focusing his military energies against the East Romans after more than 120 years of relative peace. It was only following the death of Kushnawar that the situation changed, and Kavad succeeded in reconquering Khorasan and Arahosia. His son, Khosrow I, in alliance with the newly arrived Gokturks, was eventually able to crush the Hephtalites and reconquer Bactria, Kabulistan, and Kashmir. The story of Kushnawar and Peraz remained a fable for those wishing to illustrate the folly of betraying one's word, as well as a seismic example of how the Sasanian Empire almost shared the same as the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century.
If you stayed around this far, thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment as a sacrifice to the algorithm. You can also support us on Patreon and get ad-free early access to our videos for as little as $1, or by clicking the thanks button below to leave a one-time tip. As always, we'll see you in the next one.